We've got a question from Facebook now, which is exciting. So if we accept the single market and customs union, does this mean the end of free movement? So before you answer this, would you mind giving us a little snapshot of what the single market is, what the customs union is, and what an end of free movement is, for anyone out there who's still confused by the many terms that come out of Brexit?
Yeah. No, it's not difficult to get lost in this. So the central idea of the EU is that you're removing barriers to market integration. So if you think about the UK as a country, I live in Surrey. There are no barriers to me coming to London, to live here, to trade, to work. So it's a single space. Same kind of standards. It's not that when you cross the border somewhere just outside Croydon that somehow there's somebody who's going to say different standards apply. Well, not that way. So it's basically trying to work towards something equivalent to that across the whole of the EU. So the single market is about removing barriers to the four basic elements of economic activity. So that's capital, that's goods, services, and originally workers, but workers has been kind of dragged out to be more or less everyone. So all of those things make, those four elements, those four freedoms make up the single market. So it's not just about border checks, it's also about removing regulatory differences. So if you think about environmental standards, labelling requirements, health and safety, all of those things, different countries did different things. Let's take bendy bananas. Everyone says, oh, bendy bananas. Why does the EU regulate on bendy bananas? Well, it's because countries have regulations about fruit shape and bendiness, technical term. And so instead of having 28 different sets of regulations on fruit, you have one. So it's a stupid thing, but it's always been a stupid thing, and countries have always had, not always, but they've had rules about that. So why not just make that the same, and then you remove a barrier to people who want to sell their bananas or whatever else across the EU. So all of that internal removal of barriers also has an implication externally. So you then also have to standardise your external frontier. So partly that's about customs. So you say, so if an American company brings goods into the EU, if they could bring it into the UK and not pay any duties, but if they brought it into France, they'd have to pay 20% duty. What are you going to do? You're going to do it all through the UK. So you standardise the barriers so that you don't get that kind of effect. And you also then have to give a central body, the European Commission in this case, the authority to go and represent everyone in international negotiations, because they're kind of responsible for the overall management of this. So that's the single market and the customs union, that you have the same rules, which then have external implications. So the question is, if we leave those things, do we lose free movement? Yes, we do. So if we think about free movement of people, you can be outside the single market and you can still follow the rules informally, but because you're not formally part of it, there's still that external barrier. So the EU does have concerns about people kind of getting into their integrated space, because it's integrated. So once you're in, you can move around. So yeah, whilst you might not put up any barriers of your own to people from the EU coming to the UK, you can't be sure that the EU won't impose some restrictions. It will impose restrictions if we're no longer part of the single market, because it will say, okay, you're not part of this whole affair, so we can't have the same freedoms that there are. What that means in practical terms, though, is I think worth unpacking a little bit, because often people worry that maybe that means we can't go on holiday, or we've got to have a visa, or stuff like that. It's not really about the short-term thing. Nobody's talking about quotas of people who can go to France every year from the UK. It's much more about people who want to move for extended periods of time, who'd like to work in the EU. That's the kind of more meaningful freedom of movement. So it's not the day-to-day kind of thing, holidays, business trips. It's about working, living, access to local provisions. So at the moment, as a UK national, I can go to France and I can access French welfare provision, their services with some restrictions, like a French person. So that would end at the point that the UK is no longer there. So for people who have made a move from the UK to the EU and vice versa, they then also have to try and understand what might be the impact of no longer being part of those arrangements.
Yeah.
Before you ask, we don't know, because the government hasn't actually settled that either for the UK or in negotiations with the EU. Again, that's part of that future relationship that's still to come.
Fantastic.